My name is Maggie Harger, and I'm the 2021 to 2023 Mobility 21 University Transportation Center Transportation Fellow. So I'm here to kind of introduce the series to you today. In general, the Smart Mobility Connection series is sponsored by the Traffic 21 Research Institute, as well as the Mobility 21 University Transportation Center, as an opportunity for faculty to showcase their current transportation projects. It's also an opportunity for students, fellow faculty, deployment partners, as well as the broader community to engage and network with researchers, highlight opportunities for involvement, and then also foster future interdisciplinary collaboration. For everybody who's joining virtually, the session is being recorded, and note that your microphone will be muted. If you have questions in your virtual, please send them through the chat box and we'll get to those at the end. Obviously, if you're in person, you can raise your hand. Next, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Professor Jeremy Michalek directs the Vehicle Electrification Group, which studies technology, life cycle, economic and environmental implications, consumer behavior, and public policy for electric vehicle technologies and other advanced vehicle technologies, including alternative fuels, ride sharing, and vehicle automation. He's presented policy briefs on Capitol Hill with U.S. administrations and in California state government. And his work has appeared in media outlets such as the New York Times and the Washington Post. So please help me welcome Professor Jeremy as he tells us about his University Transportation Center policy brief entitled Uber and Lyft in U.S. Cities, Findings and Recommendations.
Okay, thanks so much. So, yes, I'm Jeremy Michalek. I'm a professor in engineering and public policy. I'm a professor of mechanical engineering, and I have a courtesy equipment in civil and environmental engineering. And I also direct the Vehicle Electrification Group at Carnegie Mellon. And joined Carnegie Mellon in 2005 and started this Vehicle Electrification Group in 2009. And we have done and are still doing a bunch of work on electric vehicles. But about 6 years ago, Jake Ward joined us from the Department of Energy's Vehicle Technologies Office. And I had an EV project for him, and he said, how about we do new mobility instead? And I said, okay. So we started working, expanding our scope and looking into questions about other changes in transportation. UC Davis has calls the three main revolutions in transportation right now, electrification, automation, and sharing. Because on at least those three dimensions and on many dimensions, we've been moving people and goods a very similar way over the past century. And so we're right at the beginning of three massive changes: changing the fuel, changing who owns the vehicle, and whether you're riding in a vehicle somebody else owns, and then changing who drives. So we had been focused on electrification. And with this effort over the last 6 years, we've expanded, got more engaged with Mobility 21. And I've done a bunch of studies related to Uber and Lyft and ride sourcing. And what I'm going to talk about today is basically a summary of some of the key findings and recommendations from our studies over that time. So for context, most of you probably know that transportation is now the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And most transportation emissions come from the cars and light trucks that we drive. And ride sourcing has been one of the big shifts in how we are moving around, especially in cities. I'm going to use the terminology here for the talk today. So the term ride sharing is sometimes used to mean things like Uber and Lyft, but other times ride sharing is used to mean carpool or vanpool. So just not consistently used. Ride hailing similarly sometimes means Uber and Lyft, but sometimes people use it to mean specifically vehicles that you can hail from the street, like a taxi cab. So the word ride sourcing is the word that's specific to Uber and Lyft type vehicles. You call them from a mobile phone app and they come pick you up. The companies that offer these ride sourcing services are called transportation network companies, or TNCs. So TNCs like Uber and Lyft have been one of the largest changes to travel patterns in the past decade, especially in urban centers. Uber launched in San Francisco in 2010, but that was like a black car type service. A couple of years later that they launched UberX, this is how we think of Uber today, And by 2016, 15% of interurban trips in San Francisco were already being served by Uber and Lyft. There's, of course, been a lot of disruption from the pandemic. Pricing has changed. There's a lot that's changed since then. But this is a big impact. And so we put together a new policy brief series. Some of you have hard copies. I don't know if they're actually available in the room. But this new policy brief series can be found online on the Mobility 21 website. And it summarizes key findings from this work. Most of the work I was involved in, there's a few things in there that I wasn't involved in as well. And we call it a series because there are 4 policy briefs within it that address different dimensions of this. The first one is on the effects that Uber and Lyft have already had on cities in the United States. The second is about traffic implications of this transition. The third is environmental implications. And the last is about equity implications. So I'm going to talk through each of these 4 today and hopefully leave plenty of time for Q&A. So the first brief in this series is asking the question, how have cities changed since Uber and Lyft have entered? And there are a lot of potential positive and negative effects that TNCs can have on a variety of outcomes. So for example, with vehicle travel, having Uber and Lyft take you where you want to go has the potential to increase vehicle miles traveled because the vehicle has to drive to you in order to pick you up from the last passenger. So there's this extra deadheading, which is vehicle travel without a passenger on board. Plus, it's a new mode of travel. Maybe some trips I wouldn't have taken otherwise, now I can take them because I've got an Uber. So that extra travel could increase vehicle miles traveled, but there's an effect in the other direction as well. When I drive my personal vehicle, I've already paid most of the costs. I bought the car, I paid the insurance, I filled up the tank a week ago. The extra incremental cost I see of taking one trip is pretty small. So I might tend to take more trips, seeing that small marginal cost. But when I take an Uber, I see the full cost of that trip right on the app before I decide to take the trip. So it could influence behavior in terms of people weighing whether or not a given trip is worth it. Similarly, with vehicle ownership, when drivers want to drive for Uber and Lyft, they may buy additional vehicles. Maybe Uber and Lyft's the way they're able to afford a vehicle to begin with, or I've talked to many drivers who have a vehicle for their family, but they don't use that same vehicle for Uber. They have a separate vehicle that they use for Uber. But passengers have the opportunity to own fewer cars. Maybe I can get away with fewer cars in my household because I know that if my wife's using the car, I can take an Uber. Same thing with transit. There's some potential increase because Uber and Lyft can get you to a transit stop or from a transit stop, so it can solve that first last mile problem and make transit accessible to more people. But it's also a substitute for transit. It's more convenient, point to point. And if you've got extra disposable income, you might just prefer to avoid transit and have a more private ride. For emissions, all that extra driving to go from the last passenger to the next passenger, that creates additional deadheading emissions. But TNC vehicles tend to be newer and more efficient, and they run hot, by which I mean when you first start your vehicle, even if it's a summer day, you first start your vehicle, the catalyst isn't hot enough yet to neutralize the emissions from the engine. So that first start, the first 5 minutes that you're driving is creating an awful lot more pollution than once the vehicle heats up. The nice thing about an Uber, heats up once, and then by the time it picks you up as, say, the third passenger of the shift, it's already hot. And then there's potential effects for the economy as well. Uber and Lyft, of course, offer employment opportunity, and they may encourage economic activity, maybe getting around, maybe you end up going to more businesses because you're able to do this. You don't need a designated driver to go to the bar, et cetera. And these jobs can be really flexible, but that might also mean they can pay less because people are willing to accept lower pay in order to gain the flexibility of working when they want to work. So it could have a variety of different effects. So we wanted to understand what the data have to say about what's changed with Uber and Lyft entry. And what we use to try to do that is the fact that Uber and Lyft entered different cities at different times. So what you're seeing here is a graph of on the x-axis where Uber entered, on the y-axis when Lyft entered. If they entered at the same time, they'll be along that, for you this way, 45-degree line. And so in most cases, Uber enters before Lyft, not in all cases. And What we do is, because they enter different cities at different times, we can look to see what's changing in the trend of a city. So you've got two cities with some trend happening. Uber enters one of them, and you get a shift in that trend that doesn't happen in the city that Uber didn't enter yet. So this is a difference in difference approach. In fact, there's been an awful lot of work in the last couple of years about this difference in difference approach and what kind of estimation effects approaches are valid or have bias in them. And so we adopt some of the latest literature to look at that. So this is what we found so far. This paper, in fact, the first one, which sort of predates some of that literature, what we found was that when Uber and Lyft enter cities, there's a net increase on average of vehicle ownership, which might be the opposite of what you would expect. You'd think Uber shows up and vehicle ownership would decline because people don't have to buy as many cars. We see that that vehicle ownership increases most in cities that are more car dependent or slow growth. And what I mean by car dependent is they already had a lot of cars per capita before Uber entered. So I'd call that car dependent. In that kind of a city, the way I interpret this result is that when Uber shows up, they help out with those specific applications. Like, I want to go to the bar and I don't want to have a designated driver. We don't have to anymore. And so I'm going to use the Uber for that trip. But maybe that doesn't allow me to sell my car because I'm still live in a car dependent city, and getting around all the time with Uber and Lyft may be more difficult in a more car dependent city. So this is at least my interpretation of the results. All the statistics tell us is that there is an increase, and it's mostly in car dependent and slow growth cities. And then with transit, we find that transit displacement, so Uber and Lyft show up and transit ridership drops relative to the trajectory that the other cities stay on where Uber hasn't entered yet. That drop in transit ridership is largest in cities where there are fewer children and higher income. And that also makes sense to me, because if you're in a city where a lot of your travelers have plenty of money and they're happy to pay extra to go point to point, and there's no car seats to juggle, maybe this is the place where Uber can displace transit more easily. Whereas for the lower income riders or riders who have children, it's a different calculation. We also looked in a separate study about economic effects. This study is still a working paper, about ready to submit. What we find is that when Uber and Lyft enter cities, there's an increase in a number of desirable economic outcomes. First of all, employment increases, number of jobs increases, especially for intermittent jobs. Intermittent jobs, I mean like jobs that in one quarter weren't the same job as they were in the next quarter. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics records all of this, and we look at the difference between jobs that are consistently held versus ones that switch. And particularly for the jobs that switch, the number of jobs increases. We don't see a statistically significant effect on wages overall, but we do see it in those intermittent jobs, which are exactly the kinds of jobs that Uber offers. And then we also see an increase in GDP that outstrips what the other cities where Uber hadn't entered, what's happening in those cities. So I think on balance, there's some of these counterintuitive effects, like maybe vehicle ownership won't decrease. I think it would be hard to say that Uber could reliably reduce vehicle ownership based on these data. And maybe the effect really depends on the type of city. The idea that Uber and Lyft are going to affect different types of cities different, I think, is really important to understanding their implications. And then finally, that overall, they've had some pretty positive effects on the economy. That's the summary of the first brief. Second brief is asking about traffic effects of Uber and Lyft, traffic implications. And so to think about traffic, it's helpful to think about how Uber and Lyft affect travel patterns. So in the graph on the left, you have an imaginary bunch of city blocks and a couple of travelers that are each traveling from their origin in blue to their destination in red. And if each traveler takes their own personal vehicle, they'll start up the vehicle at blue, drive to red, and park the vehicle. But if you're taking a Uber instead, the Uber might drive to the first traveler, pick them up, take them to their destination, then travel from that destination to the next next traveler, pick them up, take them to their destination, and continue on. So those dotted lines are like the extra travel, that deadheading travel in between. This change in the way travel is managed has a lot of potential implications. And I focus on some of these externality implications, meaning costs and benefits to society that don't show up in market prices. So there's a bunch of externalities that can potentially be avoided by shifting from driving your personal vehicle to taking an Uber instead. First is the thing I mentioned about cold start emissions. That vehicle's already hot when it picks you up, which means the catalyst is already hot, which means air pollution is being neutralized. And so you can avoid starting up that car and getting that first 5 minutes of a whole lot of emissions. In fact, what started our interest in this study was another study that a whole bunch of authors, including one of my colleagues at Carnegie Mellon, had done, showing that for some species of air pollutants, one cold start produced as much as 200 miles of hot travel. So that's a pretty big difference, cold versus hot. And that made us think, I wonder how that affects Uber and Lyft. Maybe there's an air pollution benefit. The second is there's also a cold start efficiency penalty. So the catalyst deals with traditional air pollution, but also when you start the car, the lubricants are still viscous. They haven't warmed up yet, become thinner. The cylinder hasn't like expanded to its to the state that it's going to be in when it's hot. So there's a whole bunch of reasons that the vehicle is a little bit less efficient when you first start it. And so that's going to affect emissions as well. You also could potentially avoid some emissions because the TNC vehicle fleet tends to be more efficient than the rest of the fleet that you and I drive around. That kind of, you might expect that TNC drivers drive a lot, and so they would have a tendency to buy newer, more efficient vehicles, and those are also subject to more strict emissions requirements. You also could potentially avoid the search for parking. In my little diagram, you start at your origin, you land at your destination, and you stop. But in some cases, you have to drive around quite a bit to find a parking spot before you can get out at your destination. So that could be another effect. And there's also this potential for ride pooling. If a couple of us are going from Carnegie Mellon to Squirrel Hill at the same time, we might be able to get in the same car, and then you displace 2 personal vehicle trips instead of 1. And there's this potential for TNCs to become electrified first because they drive so much that it's faster to make up that initial cost of purchasing the vehicle with the savings in operating costs because the fuel's cheaper. And so there's this potential that you could get into an electric car more quickly in a TNC than in general in personal vehicles. On the other side, because there's all this additional driving, we're going to have some externalities associated with that. There's extra driving, that means extra emissions, extra potential for crashes, for congestion, and all of those things are going to weigh on the other side. And then there's also this potential for mode shifting. We're talking about shifting a private vehicle trip to a TNC, but if you shift a bus trip to a TNC, that's a whole different thing. And that's always the other potential there. So looking at that first one, the cold start, to give you a sense of the magnitude, these cold start emissions, the AP2 and the INMAP, these are 2 different ways of trying to estimate the damages caused by emissions, because when you emit, the pollutants travel downwind, they react with other things in the atmosphere, they turn to particles, then the people who live downwind breathe them, then they get increased cardiovascular and respiratory disease. So there's been a bunch of attempts to model those, and you can see, the big trend that you can see is, first of all, these are non-negligible effects. This is per start. And that they have really been declining over time. So if you're getting into a newer car, you're causing a lot less damage than if you're getting into an older car. And as I've mentioned, but now you can see in the data on the left, TNCs are newer than the general population of cars in the city or the MSA where they serve. And that's true in Chicago and in Austin, where we have data on this. And on the right, they're also more fuel efficient than the average car. So on average, getting into a TNC might help on that dimension. So when we put these things together and look just at the emissions implications, you have a question?
Yeah, so on the last slide, with regards to like the average car, I understand how you can get all the data for an Uber because everything's registered with Uber, right?
Yes.
All that information. So how did you go about getting data about the average car in Chicago, an average car in Austin?
Well, so these are the whole distribution of cars in Chicago and Austin, both the city and the MSA. That's a good question. I would have to look back because Jake did that work. And I can't remember if he got it from,
Would it be like the DMV, maybe, I don't know, something like that.
yeah, I think it came from, what do they call Polk now? Do you remember what, IHS? Yeah, Polk, IHS, they collect this information from DOTs across, or DMV, yeah, I forget, but across states and compile all that information, and we bought it for part of the study. So I don't remember if that's where he got this information, but you get details about the vehicle, so then you can decode like the VIN and you can get this type of information. So if we take all of that and we look just at the emissions implications, there's 4 kinds of emissions that I have stacked up here. On the very top are the cold start air pollution emissions in blue and the cold start greenhouse gas emissions in orange. If you drive your personal vehicle, you have some of those emissions. If you switch to a TNC, they almost go away. They don't completely go away because there's still a cold start when you turn on that TNC, but the TNC driver might serve 10 trips on a shift. And so you divide those cold start emissions by 10 and they get a lot smaller. So that's a benefit of shifting from personal to TNC. Also, even when you're hot, the air pollution that's released when the vehicle's hot, that decreases too. And that's because the TNC vehicles are newer and subject to tighter emission standards and on average. So on average, you're going to reduce air pollution going to a TNC. However, that trend doesn't hold for the greenhouse gas emissions. It is true that the vehicle's more efficient, so you get a little bit of a benefit for greenhouse gas emissions, but that is outweighed by all that additional travel that the TNC vehicle has to do to get to you and to and from. I asked, do you mind if we open these doors? I know that they're closed for noise, but I would prefer if they're open, if you didn't mind. Thank you. Okay, so on balance, if we look just at emissions, there's a net benefit, a little bit of a benefit of switching from a personal vehicle to a TNC. However, the emissions aren't the whole story. Those emissions from the last slide are down at this lower part of the graph now, and what I've added on top of them is the crash risk and congestion costs associated with driving the personal vehicle or a TNC. And so because the TNC has to drive a lot more, just being on the road creates additional risk to others about there being a crash or about others having a delayed trip because of additional congestion. So every extra vehicle you add to the road increases that cost to others. And when we monetize those costs, they're actually bigger than the monetized air emission costs. So basically the shift to TNC helps a bit with air emissions overall, but it makes things worse on traffic. And overall, we end up worse with the TNCs. And this comparison can really change depending on what scenario we're looking at. So when TNCs displace a personal vehicle, which is that base case that we were talking about, this is the number of the difference that you saw from that previous slide. And when that changes if what we're comparing to instead of a personal vehicle trip is displacing transit. Because when you displace transit, I was going to take the bus, but instead I take a TNC. When I take the bus, I don't really change the bus's emissions or its route or how long it's on the road. I mean, maybe it stops a little longer at the stop to let me on, but pretty much my impact's pretty close to zero, the marginal impact of one more traveler on a bus. Whereas with a TNC, we have that extra driving to that traveler and then to their destination. So when we compare to transit, we do a lot worse when we shift to the TNC. Electrification helps a little bit. That's the one all the way on the right. The red line is the baseline, and we can bring that down a little bit by electrifying. That case is electric vehicles with zero emission electricity. So that's like the best case for electric vehicles, no emissions at all. It helps, but it doesn't solve the problem overall because the bulk of those emissions are actually coming from traffic externalities, congestion and crashes. Where you really can get some help is if you're pooling rides. And this is kind of an extreme case that we're looking at in this graph. This is when you're pooling rides that had the same origin and destination. So this is the example I was saying earlier. I'm going from campus to Squirrel Hill, somebody else going from campus to Squirrel Hill at about the same time, and we both get in the same vehicle and there's no extra miles traveled. You can't do this with the whole the vehicle may have to navigate. In fact, you pull too much, the vehicle ends up having to drive all over town just to try to get extra people into the car. So there's a limit to how much you can do this type of pooling, but when it makes sense, pooling can really help. So bottom line on this study is that shifting a private vehicle trip to an Uber or Lyft increases average external costs by about 30-40 cents. The good part of the shift is the emissions, the air emissions. We can reduce air emissions by about 9 to 13 cents, but the same shift increases greenhouse gas emissions, increases congestion, increases crash risk and noise, and all that adds up to about 45 cents. So on balance, we do more harm than good in terms of the costs we're imposing on others when we take that trip. Yes?
So this is per trip.
Yes.
Have you looked at all? I know you talked about the marginal cost is lower for the private vehicle trip. So have you looked at all at like how it shifts behavior in terms of like how many trips someone's taking?
That's a great question. So for this study, it's just straight, I'm going to take the trip. The question is, should I take it with my personal vehicle or with an Uber? So there's no induced demand.
Yeah.
But yes, we kind of mentioned earlier, and it's not in the study, that if Uber's available, maybe I travel more. Or maybe I travel less because I sell my car and then I start seeing the price tag of every trip. I start maybe considering when I really need to take that trip. And so that's not in here. Good. So I was going to mention that there's a number of ways you could think about these results. And so the press definitely thought about these results in a number of different ways. So for example, Popular Science here thought of this study as, hey, this is a way to cut down on air pollutants. You take an Uber, you cut down on air pollutants. That's true. That is what our study said. Marketplace says, well, it accelerates climate change. That's also consistent with what our study says. And then the Times said the rideshare bubble bursts. I'm not sure our study said that exactly, but cited our study in part of an editorial about this. So there are both some goods and some bads that we find in comparing personal vehicle travel to TNCs. Okay, so one thing we could ask is, well, if pooling is good, that's one of the ways we can reduce TNC's impacts, then maybe we should be trying to encourage pooling and maybe even decrease use of TNCs during peak times when there's a lot of congestion. Like both of those things would potentially address those extra bars that I added to the top. And so one of the things we did was look at the city of Chicago because they did this just before COVID hit. They had changed their tax structure for TNCs so that they would charge TNCs more for traveling to or from target zones, which were like downtown, airports, Navy Pier. And they would give you a break if you pooled the ride. So and this is the tax that would be charged to the TNC, and some of that tax, some or all of it, gets passed on to the customer. What we wanted to know is, when Chicago instituted this policy, did it work? Was there an effect on how much people were riding on TNCs? Was there an effect on how much people pooled? And what we find, I'm just showing you the time series here, but we do a statistical analysis to figure out if there's a statistical difference in the effects that it had for the zones that were targeted versus the zones that were not targeted. And you can kind of see it here in the time series. Targeted zones had some level that decreased more after the surcharge was introduced than other zones, which maybe decreased, but not the same amounts as the targeted zone. So it looks like there was an effect. And same thing here, this is the pooling rate on the bottom, and the target zones jumped up, the pooling rate jumped up more than in the other zones that weren't targeted. So it looks like this type of approach does work. There's only a little bit of data after the introduction, because then COVID hit and then everything changed. So we just cut off the analysis there and don't try to model into COVID. So it looks like these kinds of policies can be effective at achieving goals like this. But one question you might have is, well, should they? I mean, we want to encourage pooling, but what's the right way and how much should we be encouraging pooling? So to try to answer this, we did another study in which we simulate a fleet of TNC vehicles serving rides. So we used the ride data from Chicago and So Chicago collects data on TNC rides. So we know when people requested rides, where they were going. There's a little bit of masking for privacy, but we have enough data to sort of model these trips. And what we did was model a fleet of vehicles that would try to serve all of these rides at minimum cost. So we get to decide which vehicle goes where and who picks that person up and where they go after that. And we try to do that optimally to reduce cost. And so then we ran that exercise in two scenarios. Scenario one is that we're going to try to minimize just the private costs. So that's the cost of fuel and labor and all the costs that go into paying for getting this ride to be satisfied. And then we did a second scenario in which we minimized private costs plus these externalities. So it's as if the government had used this like optimally efficient policy in which we tax the operators for the costs that they're imposing on society. We tax them the amount that we estimate those costs to be, and then we see how they change their behavior. So the goal between these two is we weren't considering those costs in private costs, but we are considering them when we do private plus external. How different are the results? And what we find is that, first of all, pooling matters. If you compare the top two cases where we just don't allow pooling, we run this optimization without allowing any pooling, to the bottom two scenarios where we do allow pooling, pooling helps. I mean, you don't pool all the rides for sure, but you can pool a number of rides and reduce those costs. However, when you compare the no tax case to the tax case is trying to represent what might be socially optimal. And the no tax case is just what the private markets would do. And the difference between the two is pretty small. There is a little bit of a benefit to having that incentive to reduce those social costs, but it doesn't change the amount of pooling all that much. There's only a small change. So this suggests to us that there's not a whole lot of room to push for more pooling and get a more socially optimal result, but because the TNCs have the incentives that they need to get pretty close to this socially optimal amount of pooling. If you're going to push a little bit more pooling, maybe you can get a little bit of improvement, but too much pooling actually could be counterproductive. It causes other kinds of costs. So let's see, why don't I keep going through? Feel free to ask me questions, but I think we're going to have a Q&A at the end, then we can decide which of these studies we want to spend the time on. So in the next study, we took a similar approach to the one I just mentioned, but asked a different question. Should Uber and Lyft electrify more cars? There's a lot of potential motivation for this. California Clean Mile Standards tells Uber and Lyft, you have to electrify more cars, or in particular, more of the miles that your cars drive need to be driven with an electric vehicle, or at least a zero tailpipe emission vehicle, which is basically an electric vehicle for now. Uber and Lyft have also pledged to shift toward electric vehicles. And there's programs like Uber Green that allow users to call for an electric vehicle or an electric or hybrid vehicle to say, I want my ride served by a clean vehicle. And actually, there's a study I haven't done yet that I've been wanting to do for a couple of years to find out if that's actually a good thing, because when you call for a green ride, it might not be the closest vehicle to you. So now somebody has to drive from farther away, and then the vehicle that was close to you has to go to someone else. So you're probably increasing, vehicle travel. And so there's some question as to whether there's some net benefit of like encouraging the vehicle owners to electrify so that they get these calls versus the kind of disadvantage of being not optimally managing the fleet. So with all that in mind, should they electrify more cars? Well, there's definitely some benefits. There's lower variable costs. Electricity is cheaper than gasoline per mile, almost across the board. There's a potential to reduce emissions if you get the electricity from a clean source. It's a natural fit for urban driving. Uber and Lyft do a lot of urban driving, not entirely. There's certainly highway driving to the airports and such, but a lot of urban driving. And when you're doing a lot of stop and go driving.
Did you consider how the tax would be used in accounting for benefits of a particular scenario?
Did I consider how the tax would be used when counting for the benefit? Oh, how the tax revenue would be used? I see. No, that's a separate question. In theory, the reason we tax the externality is not because we want the revenue. It's because we want the entities that are producing those externalities, like emissions or congestion, to consider the costs of those when they make their decisions. So there is an important question of how you would spend that revenue, but regardless of how you spend the revenue, the idea is that better decisions get made when the person causing the costs considers those costs. Thank you. So I was saying for urban driving where there's a lot of stop and go, that's the kind of driving where electrification helps a lot, really can reduce emissions. Whereas when you're on highway driving and just cruising, there's not actually that much benefit. I mean, it depends on where you get your electricity and all these other things, but there's much less benefit of electrification on highway driving. So it's a natural fit for this urban driving. That's where you want to see electrification happen. The cons are that you have to pay more upfront for the vehicle. The vehicles can't be serving trips when they're recharging. And if they have more limited range or just take longer to recharge, that's more time off of duty. And the recharging adds empty vehicle miles. You have to travel from, when your vehicle's low on charge, you have to be able to travel to a charging station to charge up and then get back on the road. So there's maybe some additional miles there. In fact, there's another study that we just presented at the Transportation Research Board of the National Academies last week that isn't in here because the results weren't done when I put this policy brief together, but where we look at that and we do find, yes, there's an increase in vehicle miles traveled for electric vehicles because they have to navigate to and from these stations. So what we wanted to know is, okay, suppose we take that same approach. We're going to optimally allocate a fleet to try to serve all of this demand. But now we get to choose what kind of fleet and which vehicles we send to which rides. So the idea is that we have gasoline vehicles we could buy. We have plug-in hybrid vehicles, and these are hybrid vehicles. And then we have battery electric vehicles. And we get to decide how many of each are going to be in the fleet and which vehicles are we going to send to which riders. All of these arcs represent like a rider who's at this location at 7 o'clock, wants to get to this location by 7:23, and we need to send a vehicle to satisfy that road, and we get to satisfy that route, and we get to decide which vehicle, and we want to decide that to be minimum cost. Of course, there's a whole bunch of details about how we optimize that and what methods we use to ensure optimality and how make it computationally feasible. But what we find in the end is that when TNCs, we run these in two cases, one when they're only minimizing private costs, and the other when they minimize private costs plus this externality. And we find that when they're considering those external costs, TNCs do use more electric vehicles, and that reduces their emission costs. For example, let's say take New York City, when there's no tax, you have something like 10% of vehicles electrified. And when there's a tax, that increases up 156% of 10%. And so you get a big potential increase in the amount of electric vehicles used. And that reduces the emissions from greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutants by about 10% in New York City. The answer is different in New York City, LA, and Austin because the price of fuel, the price of electricity are different, and also because the externalities are different. How much damage you do when you release pollution in New York City is different than in LA. It's partly about population, it's partly about where the air goes when you release it and what population gets exposed, and all of that is kind of in the model estimating these differences. So I think the big takeaways that I would see here is, number one, the answer is different when TNCs consider the costs that they impose on others. That suggests a role for policy. If they're only focused on private costs, they're going to do something that's not socially optimal. There's a reason to intervene because they're not considering these other costs. However, a blunt instrument that just says TNCs have to use battery electric vehicles, not necessarily the best, because some of those vehicles are not used very frequently. They're just used for peaking. Like most of the time they're just sitting there. And then when there's a period of really high demand, you need those extra few vehicles, send them out to meet the peak demand. And for those, you don't get as much benefit of electrification. You might be better off with a cheap gasoline vehicle you can hold on to and just use it when you need it. So there's some benefit to having flexibility in a policy, even if there's an encouragement toward electrification. Okay, the final policy brief in this series is about the equity implications of Uber and Lyft. And there's a few things that we noticed that we looked at. So one was we looked at heat waves in New York City, and we looked at differences in patterns of ridership across high income and low income neighborhoods when there was a heat wave. What you're seeing in these graphs is the blue and the yellow are other days that are the same day of the week, same month, same year, but there was not a heat warning, a weather event. after losing the word for it, heat. I can't remember the name for the heat warning, but anyway, yes. And then the red is what happened on the heat wave day. And so you can see there's a jump in ridership on the heat wave day. And we find that that jump in ridership is larger for high income areas than for low income areas. So that kind of matches your intuition, is that a high income a traveler has more opportunity to shift from whatever their normal mode is to a TNC when it's really hot out. And the low income traveler doesn't have that same flexibility, may end up with more heat exposure. We also looked at what happened when COVID-19 hit. We find here that in the orange, this is ridership from high income areas. They actually dropped a lot more than ridership from low income areas in blue, which dropped, but dropped less. And our interpretation of this is maybe a couple of things. Maybe the low income riders have fewer alternatives available. The ones that were taking TNCs were taking it because they didn't have another option. Or potentially that their travel was more essential, that these are essential workers who had to continue to travel to their job, as opposed to like, I set up an office on my third floor and tried to keep my kids out and continue to teach my class. So I didn't need to travel. So I would have dropped more. So these are some examples of how what we could see at TNCs might reveal differences that are equity relevant. The last study that I'll talk about was a study that involved looking at risk of COVID transmission on the Pittsburgh bus system, and looked at different potential ways to mitigate it, which include allowing crowding, just same buses, you just allow more people on than was ideally used during the COVID protocol. You could dispatch some extra buses or use longer buses so you can spread people out, have less exposure. You can dispatch some TNCs. Or in a potential near future, you can dispatch autonomous TNCs. Right now, the autonomous TNCs still have 2 drivers in the front, but at some point, maybe they'll have no drivers. And it turns out that dispatching TNCs doesn't help reduce the transmission risk much, because even though you're not on the bus with all these other people, there's still so many driver-passenger interactions that you don't get a lot of that reduction. Whereas if those vehicles were autonomous, that could potentially be a way to reduce transmission risk in a pandemic. So I will just comment that in this type of work, we're always trying to ask policy relevant questions, and we try to engage the policy process. So for example, we did write a comment on the California's Clean Mile Standard. This is the brief that's now available that you can find online that summarizes all the work that I've talked about today. And there's also a video, I think this one here, that summarizes this brief as well. So if you just want to watch the quick, instead of this long version you're hearing from me, you want to watch the quick version, it's there. And I will also mention that there's not a single thing I presented here that I did myself. There's a lot of collaborators and co-authors who are involved in this work, and a bunch of both current and recent funders that have funded this work. And this is some places you can go for more information. And now I'd like to know what you want to know more about.
Electrical costs for the gasoline costs. These include like road taxes into the electrical costs?
Good question. Which study?
I don't know, you just mentioned it. I can.
Electricity is usually cheaper than gasoline per mile. Right. So I believe it's going to depend on which study, but I believe in most of the studies we're talking about, we're looking at the fully tax burden. So there would be tax on both the gasoline and, but it depends what question you're asking. So if you're asking for the driver, is it cheaper to use electricity than gasoline? Then of course you're going to include those taxes because the driver's paying those taxes. When you ask like what's socially optimal, that's where you can get to like, well, but those taxes are not, that's a transfer from the user to the government. And that's not like the money is not lost, it's just moved who owns it. So you wouldn't want to include that. So I think I would probably have to go into the individual study to see which one.
California include taxes, road taxes now into electricity.
Right. So in fact, that's been a big question about how to recover revenue from gasoline taxes, which are traditionally used to fund roads. as the gasoline revenue goes away, both because vehicles get more efficient and because we switch to vehicles that don't use gasoline, then the municipalities have lost their revenue sort of stream. So yes, there's a movement to push, okay, well then we have to put that tax into the registration fee or something in order to get that tax back. So I'm not sure if I fully answered your question though. Do you want to ask it one more time?
Well, I just want to know, we act like electricity more efficient than gasoline.
Yes.
But right now, I think if you own an electric car, you're not paying road taxes.
Yes.
So,
But still, electricity is so much more efficient. So if you talk about energy efficiency, it's much more efficient to move wheels with electricity than it is with gasoline. That's including all the upstream stuff. So in electricity, you lose most of the energy in like the power plants. And then once you turn it into electricity, you lose a little bit more on the transmission lines, and once it's in the vehicle, you're using most of it to propel the vehicle. Whereas with gasoline, you lose almost all of it in the vehicle itself because the gasoline has a lot of energy and the vast majority of it just goes to heat, noise, vibration, and like a minority of it goes to actually propel the vehicle. So in both cases, you lose a lot of energy, but if you look over that whole stream, electricity is going to lose less.
Jeremy, please repeat the questions.
Yes.
We can't hear them.
Okay, sounds good. Yes. Other questions? Yeah, we'll do here and then here.
So in the last study you talked about, or you at least referenced the time of day with the heat waves. Do you think time of day is something you have considered with some of the other studies, or is it something that's worth your time to look at?
Yeah, which we do consider some time of day in some of the other studies, but what are you thinking of? Why would you want to consider time of day?
Just because,
and I'll repeat the question once you clarify.
Yeah, I would imagine that, especially in some cities, the type of rides in terms of the frequency and duration might be different. For example, like early in the morning, we had more people going to or from the airport, whereas if you hit like 6, 7, 8 p.m., you have more shorter rides because maybe they're going downtown or things like that. So is that something that you think is worth your time to consider?
Yes. So the question was about time of day and how much that influences results from these different studies. So where time of day needs to be considered. So in one aspect of that you were alluding to is that the amount of demand varies a lot over the course of a day and seasonally as well. And so when we do those studies where we're trying to optimize the fleet to satisfy demand, we have to satisfy the peak. The fleet has to be large enough to meet peak demand. And then when it's not in peak, you've got a lot of these vehicles that are being unused. So the difference in travel intensity across the day and across the year matters in terms of seeing which of those vehicles are being used. There are other things that matter. For example, when you charge your electric vehicle matters. It affects what kind of electricity is on the margin and which power plants are actually responding to increased generation to charge that vehicle. So when you do an electric versus gasoline comparison, which we've done pretty simply here or used results from other studies, but some of the other studies are our studies as well. And what you find is that, for example, in our area, you might want to charge later at night in order to reduce intensity on the grid because a lot of it's not being used. But if you do that, the power plants that are not being used are coal. I mean, those are the cheapest power plants that are not fully utilized. So those are the first ones that are going to ramp back up when you add your load there. So there can be some pros and cons to like shifting, the timing. So yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah.
Have you looked at the impact of introduction of Uber and Lyft on transportation options for blind people? I was wondering if there might be more trips due to blind or perhaps other disabilities that they wouldn't normally be comfortable taking mass transit or something, or flexibility.
Great. And so the question was about access and whether people with disabilities, blind people who don't have some transportation options, whether there might be increase in use from those populations. And we have not isolated those in any of the studies that I talked about today. But I'm certainly aware, in fact, my mother was disabled as I grew up, and there was no Uber. She could call a taxi, but it was difficult for her to get around that way. And so she was really limited, and it would have been great for her to be able to take an Uber. She might've been a person who would have increased utilization if she had access to a service like this. Not that I could have ever gotten her to use a cell phone or a smartphone, but So that's a great question. Some of the people in the group have studied a little bit of that, but nothing that I've been involved in. So I don't think I could speak very deeply about that.
In all the cost per mile of driving, like the external costs, is road maintenance considered at all? I know there's like congestion, emissions, and crashes, but like the cost to repair a road after it's damaged.
Yeah, the question is about external costs and whether they include road maintenance. So in here, we don't include road maintenance in any of those. The vast majority of damage to roads come from the heaviest vehicles. So if it's a road that semis drive on, then the cars are almost irrelevant in terms of how much damage they do. So yeah, not included in these as an externality. Question. We'll do 1, 2, 3.
So California's Clean Mile Standard has the goal of, or mandates that TNCs reach 90% zero emission vehicle miles traveled by 2030. Do you have any thoughts on that energy mix 90%? And do you think other states should adopt that as well?
Yeah. I don't have a clear answer to that. What I like about the 90% is that it's not 100% because, and I'm sorry, let me repeat the question. The question was about California's Clean Mile Standard and how stringent it is and whether that's the right stringency. It was 90%, and tell me the date, I've forgotten it already.
2030.
90% by 2030 of miles driven by TNC vehicles being electrified. And so I don't know that our research tells you the optimal way to set a policy like that. It raises questions. And one of the questions it raises is that California's rule does go further down the line to 100%. And it does say, well, there may be some disadvantages of having absolutely 100% electric, because there are some instances in which socially you might be better off, with using gasoline or using other fuels for particular applications. So there's some risk there, but that all gets balanced against a bunch of other questions on like political economy. If I was talking to someone at the TRB conference last week who said, yeah, but you say 90% and then everybody says, okay, well, I'll be on the 10% that doesn't have to worry about this. And there's something really clear about setting a goal that we all know where we're going. And so that whole, I don't study that politics side. And so there are dimensions there that maybe are important in setting policy as well. We want to make sure the policy is as informed as we can about these kinds of issues. And I would say there's clearly a rationale for policy intervention to encourage electrification. How much electrification? We're a little skeptical that 100% is always going to be the best, but some flexibility in the mechanism seems good. And there were 2 questions over here.
Yeah, just to build out from the road maintenance question. So I don't know if you have the data on this, but would you also think that the type of vehicle would change? So not just you have more vehicle in the cities, but then what type of vehicle? Because in the case of like normal sedan, then I would agree that it wouldn't cause like that much potholes. But if you think about SUV or any bigger vehicle, then that could be an issue. And especially when you think about EV have a lot more weight than typical gasoline, which would also increase the cost of like fixing pothole, asphalt, and stuff like that. But I could also see that like the demand for the like a pickup truck, then it could drop. I just estimate, but like what do you think on this topic?
Okay, great. So the question is about whether the types of vehicles that TNC owners own, I guess, might affect the impact on roads. So the earlier question was about whether we estimated the impact on roads and road maintenance costs. And this is about, well, maybe the types of vehicles, like switching to heavier EVs might have a bigger impact on road maintenance. And so it is certainly true that heavier vehicles, but I think still EV cars, we're still talking a different order of magnitude of weight than trucks that are carrying a big payload. So I still see it as being in the minority of the effect on roads. There could be something there. I haven't studied road maintenance in detail, so I'd be happy to talk if there's some place that you've seen those things.
If you were to study, like, is there a data to do that right now, or we don't have that kind of data?
For road maintenance, I guess some of there's a report that I'm thinking of, which maybe I can follow up with you afterward, that talks through all of these kinds of issues, including road maintenance. And my sense was that this was pretty negligible for the kinds of questions that we're asking here, but I haven't tried to calculate it. So maybe there's something there. I guess what I think of more with weight, there was a study that Costa Samaras recently published in Science, I want to say, with a couple of co-authors about weight of EVs and the impact that might have on a crash externality. So like if your vehicle is heavier, then there's a different impact when there's collisions in terms of like who's getting hurt and how hurt. And so there's still some interest in lowering the weight of all vehicles for a number of reasons. Road maintenance hasn't been the top one on my list, but I think there are some of these others like safety that at least there's some word suggesting it could be.
My question was just about like the emissions impacts, because you mentioned like obviously bringing in the newer vehicles is gonna have a emission reduction impact. Do you have an estimate as to how long that will last as more people are purchasing like electric vehicles for their personal vehicle?
So let me see if I understand your question. So you're saying as you switch to electric vehicles, there's electric vehicles or TNCs? Which one are you asking?
Well, you were saying the TNCs like coming into the city were having an emission reduction, but I'm saying in general, people will probably be purchasing more fuel efficient vehicles like as years go by.
I see.
So like, do you have an estimate for how long that will be a substantial impact?
I see. So then let me repeat the question, see if I get it right. So in this study, we looked at that TNC vehicles tend to be newer than personal vehicles. And so therefore they're lower emitting because they're under tighter standards. But that might not persist in the future because as people get cleaner vehicles and more EVs, there might not be that benefit towards shifting to TNC. So how long would that kind of benefit last? That's the question. Yeah, I think that's true. However, I still think we have a ways to go. Gasoline's going to stay dominant for a while. I mean, we're big shifts toward electrification. It's still going to, I mean, if everybody in this room and across the world wanted an electric vehicle and never wanted to buy a gasoline vehicle again, it would still take us a decade to transition the fleet because the vehicles we have now are going to last a while. So, and that's definitely not the case. So we're doing studies on electric vehicle adoption, and there's really different types of consumers. Some of them are pretty strongly opposed still. So yes, I think that you're right, but I still think we've got a pretty long transition time in which this difference may continue to be important.
So Jeremy, we're at time.
Okay.
But people are welcome to stay and have conversations. Maggie, do you want to?
I can do my last little promotion. My closing statement. So thanks everybody for taking the time. You'll be getting an email with a short survey about this event. So please try and fill that out. And then our next SMC will be on Friday, February 10th with Rahul Manhangram of the University of Pennsylvania. That will be on Zoom only, I believe. But if you are wanting to attend, please try and attend that. So thanks, everybody.